Chapter 3. The Great War, 1914 to 1918. The weakness of the Turkish Empire, which was beginning to break up, attracted the appetite of the West. The struggle to take up positions and the arms race began. As they awaited the fall of the empire, all the powers were honing their axes in order to cut as much firewood as possible. These expectations made the Balkans an extremely overheated part of the earth. On the eve of the war, Serbia had benefited from the Balkan conflicts and was becoming bolder. Its army had freed the Macedonian Slavs from the Turks and aspired to do the same with the Slavs under the domination of Austro-Hungary. Unity or Death, the secret society which had infiltrated the Serb army, and the head of the Serb intelligence service plotted the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The chance came in 1914. At 11:15 in the morning of June the 28th, the student Gavrilo Princip shot dead the imperial heir and his wife Sofia in Sarajevo. Both the Emperor Franz Joseph and the Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza were reluctant to use the magnacide as an excuse to begin hostilities. But others saw it as the chance to humiliate Serbia and Russia, who were stirring up the southern Slavs. Among these was Kaiser Wilhelm II, who sent this message to Vienna: "Things have their limits, and eventually there comes a time when one cannot just look on." War seemed inevitable. On July the 23rd, 1914, Austria sent an ultimatum to Serbia, which replied with an undertaking to obey the verdict issued by the Hague Tribunal. But Vienna remained unsatisfied and broke off relations. It was in a hurry to decide the matter by force of arms. Germany preferred to limit intervention to the occupation of Belgrade as a guarantee that Serb promises would be carried out. Vienna bombarded the capital on July the 29th, and Russia ordered mobilization. August 1914 was a terrifying month. On August the 2nd, Germany requested Belgium's permission to pass through this country on the way to France, while German troops were entering Luxembourg. Permission was refused. The next day, Germany declared war on France, alleging hostile actions. On the nights of the 2nd and 3rd of August, the Germans entered Belgium, and Britain declared war on Germany due to the treaties in force. George V, who had succeeded Edward VII in 1910 and whose reign had strengthened the constitutional character of the British monarchy, wrote that day in his diary, "It is a catastrophe, but it is not Britain's fault." On August the 5th, Austro-Hungary declared war on Russia. On August the 6th, Serbia declared war on Germany. Montenegro, in solidarity with Serbia, declared war on Austro-Hungary and Germany. From the 10th to the 12th of August, France and Britain declared war on Austro-Hungary. Unexpectedly, Japan declared war on Germany on August the 23rd, and Austro-Hungary was at war with Japan on the 25th and with Belgium on the 28th. Turkey took 2 months to decide whether to enter the war on the side of Germany and Austro-Hungary or not. The atmosphere was enervating. Britain earmarked £30 million for the war budget. The Russians tripled the size of their army. The world's leaders were convinced it would not last long. The Allies trusted in their superiority. The new weapons were going to be decisive both as regards the violence and length of the conflict. The new rifles were quicker to use and more effective. The tank appeared on land, the submarine at sea, and planes in the air. In September, the German submarines sowed terror at sea. They sank the British cruisers Hogue, Abukir, and Cressy, and the battleship Hawk, and October the 11th, the large Russian battleship Palarda. In January 1915, Germany bombarded the suburbs of London using Zeppelins and used incendiary bombs on the London docks. The destructive power of the armies grew daily. The tanks devastated the trenches. Winston Churchill had realized their usefulness and had ordered their manufacture in huge numbers. Another terrifying weapon was gas. The Germans began to use it in 1915 in a massive attack on the Belgian front at Ypres. Faced with this new danger, the gas mask was invented, employing a chemically treated cotton cushion. The first military maneuvers were made by Germany, which occupied Belgium in record time, following the Schlieffen Plan, which foresaw a war on two fronts. On the Russian front, Germany would be on the defensive. On the French front, it would attack with a pincer movement. The French army was overrun in Alsace-Lorraine and Luxembourg, and on September the 2nd, General von Kluck was 25 kilometers from Paris, forcing the government to withdraw to Bordeaux. On the Russian front, the Tsarist troops invaded eastern Prussia and threatened the city of Königsberg. This meant that the troops had to be transferred from the French front, and Hindenburg, appointed commander of the 8th Army, defeated the Russians at Tannenberg in one of the most brilliant strategic operations of the war at the end of August 1914. German action on the Russian front harmed their French front, where the Marne miracle occurred in September 1914, with a forced German withdrawal before Marshal Joffre. However, the setback was unimportant. The Germans withdrew to the line on the Aisne and concentrated on its defense. The conflict then turned to attempts by both sides to encircle each other, and soon the war became bogged down. This situation continued almost until the end of the war. The Allies did not advance more than 5 kilometers throughout the whole of 1915, and this was at the cost of 1.5 million dead. Everyone realized that the war was not going to be short. The new weapons meant new strategies. Machine gun nests and artillery were obstacles to any movement. The trenches became the front, with a network of small fortresses and a brutal cost in lives. The front then moved to paper, propaganda. The press organized smear campaigns. Britain and France were said to be fighting against barbarism, and the Germans were presented as idealists who were going to free the world from the British yoke. Everyone had to believe in something to justify this madness, especially the soldiers who were told, "You fight for democracy," and the enemy was depicted as a brute being. The propaganda also tried to win the sympathy of the neutral countries. Resort was made to all kinds of things. Pamphlets and posters described Wilhelm II as the new Attila. From August 1914, the British government used censorship, misinformation, and calumny. Aircraft were first used in 1914 on reconnaissance flights. When the war stagnated in the trenches, aircraft took an active part in the development of strategy. Air photography began to be used. In 1915, the machine gun was first used. In 1915, a bomb was designed with a detonating mechanism in the point, filled with explosives, and equipped with fins to ensure that it fell on the point. The Germans attacked Dover in 1914, and in January 1915, Yarmouth was bombed. In May 1915, London was bombed. A taste of what was to come in September 1916, when 15,000 kilos of bombs fell on the capital and other areas of the country. The air defense war soon began. The initial elation was followed by exhaustion. This was a consequence of the lack of provisions, the number of casualties, the enlistment of soldiers who were progressively younger or older. There was also extremist agitation to be dealt with. Britain dominated the sea but was threatened by German submarines and longed for a decisive naval battle. German strategy consisted in having the submarines decimate the British fleet. In January 1916, Admiral Scheer took command of the German fleet. Yarmouth and Lowestoft were bombarded in April, and a trap was set for the British Southern Fleet. On May the 30th, 5 German battleships and 4 cruisers sailed towards a point on the Norwegian coast. These were followed at 50-mile intervals by ships under Scheer's command. The British sent the whole fleet to Skagerrak, crossing the German route. There were 100 ships with 45,000 men on board under the command of Admiral Jellicoe. Unknown to them, they were about to come up against a fleet of 148 ships and 60,000 men in what was going to be the greatest naval battle in history, the Battle of Jutland. The economic blockade of the enemy was vital. Germany mined the British coast in February 1915, while its submarines inflicted Allied losses of more than 830,000 tons only in the month of April 1917. The submarine also threatened freedom of navigation for the neutral countries, and this would lead to the United States entering the conflict. It had already been on the point of entering the war in 1915 after the sinking of the Lusitania, but Wilson was satisfied with compensation. The German Admiralty knew that only the submarines would force the British to loosen their blockade of the North Sea. But they made a mistake by sinking the Sussex, which had American and Spanish citizens on board. Germany lost the neutral support of Spain, and the United States entered the war. America had been detached from events. Prosperity was in the air. In 1915, the high-powered car became fashionable, and Wilson created a national network of roads where the fabulous cars of the epoch could speed along. At the start of hostilities, there was some sympathy for the Allies, and those in favor of intervention among the higher classes made themselves heard at demonstrations. However, the working class, the immigrants who believed that in Europe the conflicts were in the interest of the empire, the market, or the colonies, were pacifists. At first, the United States only sent war material. The first soldiers arrived in June 1917 under the command of General John Joseph Pershing. By the end of that year, there were 180,000 American troops. In Europe, German success on the Russian and Serb fronts and the Allied failure in the Dardanelles were encouraging for Germany and Austria, especially after the Italians had been contained in the Alps. The Allies went on the attack in order to help Russia and to try to break the lines, but they failed. During the Artois offensive in May and June and the Champagne offensive in the autumn, the Allies lost large numbers of men and much material. Falkenhayn wished to take advantage of the German success in order to carry out a war of attrition at Verdun in the spring of 1916. Operations began on February the 21st. The terrain had been mined and blood flowed as never before. The sector defended by Pétain resisted. The battle lasted 6 months, and at the end, 500,000 corpses littered an immense scene of death. The victory was costly for the Allies. The Germans lost the best of their army, and moreover, after this battle, Romania joined the Allies. Falkenhayn's failure led to Hindenburg joining the military leadership. The Reichstag voted for an armament program and obligatory military service. The new military command seized Romania at the end of 1916. This meant having access to the Romanian oil fields, vital for Germany's submarines. The weakness of the Russian government meant it was likely to fall. After the disaster of Brusilov, the Tsar tried to approach Germany, but Germany's declaration of Polish independence on November 5, 1916, made this impossible. Pius X died in the first days of the war. Benedict XV proposed peace formulas and put all his efforts into helping the prisoners and the casualties of both sides, as well as defending the rights of peoples. 3 years of war had unhinged Europe. The anxiety and exhaustion were used by the communists, trade unions, and socialists to talk of revolution instead of peace. These ideas were spread at the Zimmerwald Conference in September 1915. This had been convoked by the Italian socialists, and the propagation of these ideas was entrusted to the Socialist International, directed by Lenin. The spiritual and material crisis at the end of 1916 prepared the soil to sow the revolutionary message on both sides. At the end of 1917, it was impossible to know the result of the war. Russian surrender and the withdrawal of the Romanians gave respite to Germany, which was freed from the Eastern Front and could attempt an advance on Paris. This attempt led to resounding victories. On October the 24th, 1917, the Germans broke through the Italian lines at Caporetto in the Alps. The Italian soldiers deserted, thinking that it was all over. That victory allowed General Ludendorff to concentrate on the Anglo-French front. He painstakingly prepared what seemed to be a final effort. He proposed to fix limited objectives and carry out surprise attacks at numerous points and at different intervals so as to exhaust the enemy's reserves. The Grand Offensive began on March the 21st, 1918. The German army, expert in trench warfare and with experience gained in Flanders, Artois and Champagne, knew the terrain and broke through the Allied lines, separating the French and the British. Faced with the German push, the Allies gave combined command to Marshal Foch. The Germans attacked again in April and May, with victories in Flanders and Le Chemin des Dames. But Allied superiority was an ill omen for Germany and Austria. The Germans advanced once again towards the Marne and attacked Lassigny. For Germany, time was an important factor, while for the Allies it was not. Ludendorff went all out on a fifth offensive on the Marne. The battle was long and intensive, from the 15th of July to the 2nd of August 1918. The Allies won, and the Germans limited themselves to defense. The increase in American troops and material inclined the scales towards the Allies. Foch adopted the tactic of launching simultaneous attacks at different points before the Great Tank Offensive of August 8, 1918. The German lines weakened. Ludendorff deployed his troops on the Siegfried Line, abandoning what had been won. The Siegfried Line could not hold for long, and Foch launched concentric attacks and put an end to the last German enclave on French soil after action at Saint-Quentin, Cambrai and Laon. The war was going badly for Germany. Bulgaria was forced to sign an armistice with the Allies. The troops of General Franchet d'Espèrey advanced on Serbia and Austro-Hungary. In the Middle East, the British destroyed the Turks near Damascus after Palestine had also fallen to the British. These defeats were a threat to Austro-Hungary, whose situation was becoming critical. Moreover, the Western Army was about to be overrun at any moment. All of these events led Ludendorff to ask the Kaiser to request an armistice based on Wilson's points. Wilhelm II received the news with consternation, as a few days before he had been convinced that Germany would win the war. In January 1918, Wilson announced his 14-point plan for peace, among which were some wise ideas such as freedom of navigation, free trade, arms reduction, and the creation of a League of Nations. In Germany, a parliamentary government was set up under the presidency of Prince Max de Baden, who accepted Wilson's conditions on October the 5th. The Austrian Emperor, Karl I, requested a separate armistice. The Czechs and the Croats declared independence, and October the 30th, Turkey fell. Ludendorff was obliged to abandon the general staff, and the government accepted some of the conditions imposed by Wilson. At this point, Germany was in chaos. On November the 4th, the North Sea Fleet mutinied. On November the 8th, the people of Munich rebelled, and the following day a general strike was declared in Berlin. Wilhelm II abdicated and settled in Holland. The German delegation accepted everything they were asked to sign in the forest of Campagne on November the 11th, 1918, inside General Foch's carriage at Redonde. Impositions were made which had nothing to do with Wilson's 14-point plan, and even less to do with Pope Benedict XV's plan for peace. Germany left the occupied territories, including Alsace-Lorraine. Their troops withdrew to the right bank of the Rhine. They were obliged to hand over weapons, aircraft, and trains. The battle fleet was to be interned in Scapa Flow, a British naval base. The return of prisoners was not to be reciprocal, and the blockade was to be continued. The nightmare, which had produced 8 million dead and 20 million wounded, had passed. However, there was a fight to obtain more land, more influence, and more power. Japan had declared war on Germany in order to seize its possessions in China and the Pacific. The League of Nations, with its mandates and protectorates, was to consolidate the status quo. The great powers and their friends would share out the booty. Everyone knew that after the war, the world would be different. In 1916, the social climate in Russia was ripe for an attempt to gain power. In an atmosphere of intrigue surrounding the Tsar, on February 14, 1917, the workers took to the streets in St. Petersburg. Some asked for bread, and others wanted the Duma to meet. Nicholas thought this was unimportant. The strikes and the climate of agitation brought the police out, and there were deaths. Nicholas II abdicated on March 15th. The provisional government moved the imperial family from Pskov to Tsarskoye Selo and from there to Ekaterinburg, where they were assassinated by the Commissar Jurkovsky, the commander of the guard, and Medvedev from the local Soviet on the night of July 16, 1918. 2 days later, the Soviet constitution came into force and civil war broke out. On September 12th, the Republic was proclaimed, and on the 25th of September, Trotsky prepared the coup d'etat with Lenin, who had taken refuge in Finland. The people hardly intervened in the revolution at all. It was a minutely planned technical revolution. Russia fell into the hands of the Communist Party, and no one explained why. The Bolsheviks, who had fewer than half the votes, dissolved the assembly in January 1918. The Council of People's Commissars, which represented a minority, were in real command at the Kremlin, resorting to terror through the Chekas, which were crueler than the Tsarist police and prisons had been. In September 1918, the extermination of the aristocracy, the clergy, and the middle classes was begun. Was this perhaps the class struggle? The number of deaths during those days of murder en masse will never be known, and this was just the beginning. The Red Army, founded by Trotsky in 1918, would be capable of much more. In 1915, David W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, the most expensive film ever made, had its first showing at Clune's Auditorium in Los Angeles. It lasted 3 hours and had novelties such as panoramic shots and close-ups. David Griffith was also director, producer, and scriptwriter of Heroes of the World, a crudely realistic film about the war which had just finished. In 1916, Tom Mix became the legendary star of the Western in silent films and packed out cinemas with films such as The Challenge of Single Parker. Tom Mix was the paladin of justice and never lost his famous hat during the entire film. In 1917, Pat Sullivan had the biggest hit in cartoons with his cat, Felix. The stars like Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and Douglas Fairbanks bought war bonds to help the country. These were the years of silent films, and the indisputable heroine was Mary Pickford, America's girlfriend. Sport was brought to a sudden standstill. The war prevented holding the Olympic Games. Football was becoming Europe's favorite sport, while baseball and American football were all the rage among the working classes, while polo was played by the wealthy. In 1915, Einstein demonstrated that the world had a fourth dimension, space-time over and above the 3 dimensions already known. According to him, the universe is limited and immobile. A short time later, William de Sitter talked of the universe in expansion, while the astronomer James Jeans stated, "The cosmos is a soap bubble which has burst and is dissolving at vertiginous speed." The Earth seemed insignificant in a huge, immense universe. The stars and the planets were specks of dust immersed in a world which curved. Man, who made so much noise, was really quite insignificant.